out. As I said before, here, please pass these around, Josh. When you take one, please be careful not to get food, not to get it in your food. No, hand them out carefully. Don't let it dip it. Okay, just give them to someone who's not going to dip it into their challah. Okay.
You let it out.
What?
You let it out.
Yeah, whatever. You could leave it in. I don't know. Okay. On the handout is the. Let me tell you what you have here so that we understand. I'm going to tell you the journey we are taking, and then I will take you there. I'm very, as I said before, I'm very excited about this year. It's parts of it have been on my mind for a couple years, and parts of it I've only been exposed to very recently. No crinkling bags. Too late. You'll eat it after this year. No crinkling bags next to me. Unless you want to, you can go into the other room. Anything that crinkles, just. I had one. I don't need this. There's another handout. Pass it down to Michael. There you go. Okay. Right here. So you can use this one because I have it in the original book. Okay. We'll share this for now. Here's what we're going to do. On this side of the page, right here, this 2-pager. We're not going to be reading all of it, but at first I was going to think just to tell you the idea, but his language and the way he presents the idea is so beautiful that I thought that it would be best we'll actually work through the text. And that's the only text that we're really going to do inside together. We'll also do a couple small pieces on the flip side. We're not going to do every word of it, but we're going to do so on one side you have, this is 2 pages out of a 3-page article written by Rav Yaakov Weinberg. Rav Yaakov Weinberg is better known by his book of responses, book of Shalos and Tshuvos, called the Sridei Eish. He lived most of his life in the 20th century. He survived the war in Europe, and he was a great gadol, a tremendous Talmid Chacham, a tremendous original thinker. He was a Rav in Switzerland. And in his writings, so there's a book of his writings. There's a few books. He has his Kedushim on Shas, he has his Shalos and Tshuvos, and he has a book of his writings of just various things. Machshava. He writes a history of the Musar movement. He wrote very interesting essays. And that book is called Lifrakim. And in that book, Lifrakim, this essay appears. There's this essay about the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos Daf Pei Chet Amud Bet. I'm not going to tell you more about Rav Yaakov Weinberg now. You could look him up. There's a Wikipedia page with a lot of information about him. He was a really great, one of the great Gedolim of the middle part of the 20th century. So we're going to be doing a piece by him. And when we finish doing that piece, I'm not just doing here's 3 different approaches. There's an interrelationship between these approaches. Okay, what's going to happen here is we're going to take a look at how he understands this Gemara. And he's going to bring out a very deep psychological point about this Gemara. And then we're going to take a look at what Rav Kook writes about this Gemara, and we're going to see that Rav Kook goes in the exact opposite direction. Okay, so we're going to be setting up 2 opposing views of the lesson of this piece of Gemara. Okay, here we go. Piece of Gemara is printed at the top of the page. Right underneath his title, he actually quotes the whole Gemara. That's why I didn't photocopy the piece of Gemara, because it's right there in the article. Here we go. It's a pretty famous Gemara. A lot of you have probably heard of it before. And they encamped, and they stood. Bnei Yisrael stood bitachtit hahar. That's the words. Bitachtit hahar means in the foot of the mountain, in the base of the mountain. So obviously that means that they were standing around the bottom of the mountain, but spinning off of the use of in the mountain, bitachtit hahar. In the base of the mountain. So a drasha, a medrash is stated, a drasha is stated by Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa. Amar Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa, Melamed, this teaches shekafa aleihem et ahar kigigit, that they stood in the bottom of the mountain. This teaches that HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the mountain over them like a barrel. Right, he held it over them like a barrel. Va'amar lahem, and he said to them, Im atem makablim et haTorah mutav. If you receive the Torah, if you accept the Torah, good. Ve'im lav, and if not, sham tehei kvuratchem. There will be your burial place. If you don't accept the Torah. You guys have heard of this Gemara? Yeah, it's a famous Gemara.
How does that make sense?
Don't worry. At the end of the year, if something doesn't make sense, we'll come back. Okay. Amar Rav Bar Yaakov says, "Mikan moda Rabba Raita." From here, there's a great objection. There's a great legal problem, a legal deficiency with the Torah. Because if you enter into a deal with a gun to your head, that's not a valid deal. It's not a valid covenant. Right? You know, if I hold a gun to someone's head, to a woman's head, and I say, "Here, Hareat Mekudesha, I would like to marry you. Here's a ring. If you don't accept it, I'll shoot you." It's not exactly a valid relationship. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu forced us to accept the Torah, Modo Rabba L'Oraita, this is an objection to the entire Torah. This calls into question the entire covenant we have with God. It's not really a valid agreement. You have enough food in front of you, okay? Just chill out. You can eat more afterwards. Get into the shir. Don't worry about your food. Okay? Mikan Moda Rabba L'Oraita. Amar Rava. Says Rava, no problem. Don't worry about the fact, because we have a problem. If we accepted the Torah because we were forced to, at gunpoint, and that's a very big problem. That's what Rav Bar Yaakov says. So Rava answers and says, don't worry about it. Amar Rava, Af al pichein, nevertheless, Hadur kibluha b'mei Achashverosh. They went ahead and reaccepted it. They reaccepted the Torah in the days of Achashverosh. Dichtiv, as it says in the pasuk in Megillat Esther, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim. The Jews, Kimu, they fulfilled v'kiblu, and accepted. The Jews fulfilled and accepted. Kimu masha kiblu kvar. They fulfilled what they had already accepted. Okay, let's summarize this Gemara very briefly. There are three statements. One by Rav Avdimi, one by Rav Acha, and one by Rav. Rav Avdimi says, God held the mountain over our heads, and He coerced us. He forced us at gunpoint to accept the Torah. Rav Acha says, oh my gosh, if that's true, then we have an objection, a legal objection to the entire covenant with God, to the entire Torah. Rava answers and says, don't worry about it. When it came to Purim's story, in the time of Achashverosh, they reaccepted the Torah. As it says in the Megillah, Kimu v'kiblu. Okay, here we go. Now, I'd like you to take a look at the words of the Sridei Eish. We're gonna read. I'm gonna read and translate, and this is the only part we're gonna do that. In Rav Kook, a little bit for a few lines. In Rav Kook, we'll do it also, but mostly I'm just going to be talking. But here, I'd like you to look inside the text, just because his Hebrew is so beautiful. Kvar amdu balei atosvot. He said the balei atosvot have already asked the question. Actually, we're going to skip the first few lines, and I'll just tell you the first couple lines outside, because he mentions a Tosfot that he assumes you know, because it's a well-known Tosfot. He was writing for a knowledgeable audience. Tosfot asks right here, says, wait a second. It says in the Torah, Nasa v'nishma. It says in the Torah that they accepted it willingly. Why is Rav Avdimi saying that Bnei Yisrael were forced to accept the Torah? They accepted it at gunpoint. If they were willing to accept it willingly, if you read this week's parsha, next week's parsha, all of Parshat Yitro and the end of Mishpatim, which has the whole scene at Matan Torah, they seem pretty happy about it. They seem pretty fine with it. They say Nasa v'nishma, right? That's what we were raised on, right? Nasa v'nishma. They willingly accepted the Torah. Just move this? They said Nasa v'nishma. So why does God have to hold a gun to their head? Why does He have to hold the mountain over their head if they were willingly accepting the Torah anyway? Right? You get the question? So why does He have to do that? So Tosfos gives an answer. They give whatever answer they give. They say that this is just an insurance policy by God to make sure that they don't renege later on. It's not the greatest answer. Well, we're going to set Tosfos aside. I'd like you to jump down to the fifth line of the first paragraph of the Sridei Eish, after the period where he says chok. See that word? Chok husam b'nefesh ha'adam. Says there is a law that it was placed into the soul of man. It was basically God placed an instinct, a law, a rule of human nature. Shelibo holech shevi, that man's heart is taken captive. Asur b'chivlei hakoach v'hagbura. it becomes chained. Man's heart. Wait, still with the food? Man's heart becomes chained, becomes captive through the power and greatness. Asher lemura'ut chitzonim atzumim. It's human nature that when great events take place, they capture our hearts. Ukechol asher tirbe midat ha'oz va'atokef asher lemura'ut. And the stronger the power and strength of the events that we experience, kein tigdal gam midat haroshem v'atmadat pulotav b'nefesh adam. The more the impact that those events have on the soul of man. Again, so he starts off, he says, human nature. When you experience an event, has an emotional impact on you, the greater the power and grandeur of the event, the greater the emotional impact on the human being. That's human nature. There's a great strength to impressions, to strong impressions that have their basis in the sense of hearing and the sense of sight. To pour out their enchantment over the entire human being. And a person might never leave those enchantments the rest of his life. They accompany the man throughout his way of life. And he cannot get away from them and free himself from them. Very beautiful language. The Sri Deish says the human being is built in such a way that when they experience impactful events, the impression, the emotional impression that those events have, if it's a really great and powerful event, they can have an impression that's very long-lasting. And it could stay with the person throughout the rest of his life, the impression of these great events. Ephes is a poetic way of saying however, like alas. Deot ve'emunot shemekorah nach v'rak b'rishamim marivei ayin v'lokhet lev me'ein elu. It says, ideas and beliefs that have their source in impressions that captivate the eye and capture the heart. Listen carefully. Again, ideas and beliefs that have their source. You with me, Alex? Yeah. Ideas and beliefs that have their source in impressions that capture the eye and capture the heart. But they're not based enough on the depths of the spirit and the hidden aspects of the soul. I'm just going to say it in English. I'm going to read it with my eyes. I'm going to just say it in English. Well, I think it'll be clearer to understand. I'm going to start this paragraph over. Ideas and beliefs that have their source only in impressions that capture the eye and capture the heart, such as these, and are not based enough in the depths of the spirit and the hidden parts of the soul, it's possible that they could cause a great downfall when another event, even more powerful than the first one, comes and inherits the place of the original visions. He says, if you have an idea or a belief that's based on an experience that you had, and the impression and the emotional impact of that experience, no matter how great that impression, if along comes another event that's even more impressive, it'll overtake the first impressions. Because if it was an emotional reaction, then if something else is more impactful, it's going to erase the impact of the first thing. Right? That's the way we are emotionally as human beings. Does everyone follow what I'm saying here? Yeah? Okay. Right. In the soul of man, the last impact is the one that we feel most. That's the one that has the most impression. This is I'll call it the bus ride home from the NCSY Shabbaton syndrome. Right? At Havdalah. everyone's like changing their life and taking on like, oh, this is like, there's so this religious fervor, and but what happens, like, it lasts till like Monday, like, because it's emotions.
Lasts till 11 o'clock.
No, but the original, I'm going to continue translating him, the original impressions are weakened or wiped out completely. A person who is making laws, or a teacher, listen carefully here, this is what I'm talking about. A teacher is not allowed to judge the degree of his success in his endeavor solely based on the results that his first efforts produce in a good environment. Rather, this teacher is obligated to wait until those initial impressions have gone away, and then he could see clearly how successful he was. In other words, when you're in yeshiva and the environment is right and you're responding to your environment and to the experience of it all, it's hard to tell what's going to stick, because that's the way humans are. The environment we're in and the experiences we're having enchant us, and they draw us in, and they create situations where we just think and feel a certain way because of the environment that we're in, because of the experience we're having, because of how great the experience is. The more powerful the experience, the more of a sound and light show, the more emotional the experience, the greater we'll feel at the time that we're being impacted. It says this, now we're up to the paragraph, Tchunat Anosh. This characteristic of the human being requires understanding. And then we'll be able to understand this Gemara that we started with. When the Jewish nation, the Israelite nation, came to Har Sinai, they were attacked by such powerful impressions of greatness and strength that they're impossible to even fathom. The entire mountain burning, a ring of flames around it, thunder and lightning, the voice of God, clouds of glory, unbelievable supernatural occurrences before their eyes. A great voice heard all throughout the camp and all throughout the land. This was the first time in the history of mankind that God, the creator of heaven and earth, is speaking to human beings in a public way. And human beings of flesh and blood are seeing such wonders. Picture yourself at the scene. And he says here, who is there who would not be terrified and trembling in a religious environment like that? Who is there who would not cleave to his Creator? Who is there who would be able to escape from the impact of that experience? And here's the punchline. Listen carefully, gentlemen. Who is there? Could we imagine a man of flesh and blood who experienced such an occurrence and he was not affected to the point of saying Na'aseh v'nishma? Is it possible for someone to have been at Har Sinai, a human being of flesh and blood? God built us, He hardwired us to respond to great events emotionally and to feel impacted and to get swept up in them. That's the way we are. So if you were there at Har Sinai, would it be possible to withstand the urge to say, I do, I accept, Na'aseh v'nishma? Would it be possible for a human being to think clearly under those circumstances? So this call, the call of Na'aseh v'nishma, next paragraph, emerged from an instinct in the nature of man because he is a man. From an awareness of this deep characteristic of the human being and of the mysteries of the human being, the Gemara is explaining something to us. The Gemara is explaining this depth of the human psyche. And it's telling us that Bnei Yisrael were basically forced to accept the Torah. They were basically forced to say Nasa v'Nishma. The powerful impressions that they received at Har Sinai created an environment that it made the answer, Nasa v'Nishma, we accept the Torah, not a choice. It was as though they were being forced. The force of this experience, of this great experience, was so powerful that their free will to accept the Torah or not accept it was about as free as saying you're either going to accept the Torah or you're going to die. This is a very deep point. What he's saying here, this is the Sri Deyesh, Rav Yaakov Weinberg. Unbelievable point. Listen to what he's saying. He says when the Gemara says God held the mountain over them, he says what the Gemara is doing, what Rav Avdimi is doing, is he's saying this is what's being described when you read about Matan Torah. When it talks about the great sound and light show and all the experiences that they had and coming on the heels of the 10 plagues and Kriyas Yamsuf, they had no choice in the matter. Yeah, they technically had a choice, but a human being, we're only human. Human beings in an environment like that, with that type of experience going on around them, don't have they couldn't possibly have the clear-headed sense to accept the Torah or not accept it. It's essentially like they were being forced. It was as though there was a gun to their head. Because the human nature, the natural reaction to such powerful external events, the instinctive reaction was so powerful that they essentially had no free will in the matter. He says that's what the Gemara means. Yes?
So the term Hashem held a mountain over them is just an expression of force.
Exactly. He's saying the term that God held the mountain over them is exactly that. It's a mashal for the whole experience as described in this week's parsha in Shmos Yotes.
So why death? Why death is the alternative?
Because it seemed that powerful, like that much of not an option to not accept it.
As if a mountain was over your head.
As if, like, it's this, like, you die. Like, it was that powerful an experience. Yes?
I guess I misinterpreted the Torah. I thought when you said it was that when God lifted the mountain over their head, it was like they didn't have any free choice because it was such a powerful thing.
No. What I'm saying, he's saying that the scene at Har Sinai, as described in the Psukim, was such a powerful scene that it's as though God was holding the mountain over their head. Like, meaning they had as little free will to accept the Torah or not accept it, just based on the impact of the scene. But don't worry, it's still going. It just blacks out. Based on the impact of the scene, as if, because the human being is just affected by events that way. You get caught up in things. We've all had that experience at different times. And he said that there's no way at an event like that, an unprecedented event like that, any human being could withstand the urge, the natural urge, and it was as though they were forced into it. He said that's what the Gemara means. Now, the last paragraph we're going to do here is this paragraph that starts B'Tnaim Ka'ela. This is here, and now he's going to get into the whole thing about the time of Achashverosh, the Purim story. The later part of the piece of Gemara. B'Tnaim Ka'ela. Under these circumstances, the acceptance of the Torah is not an inner, true acceptance. It's superficial. It's not a real solid acceptance of the Torah. He says, and even after they enter Israel, the chosen land, and they inherit the land, and they have this, everything's wonderful, and God gives them each their portion, and they each they're each sitting under their grapevine and their fig tree. He says the Torah still had not become second nature to them. It still had not become an essential part of their identities. Even after they entered the land of Israel, the Torah had still not become an essential part of who they were until they went into Galut. When they went into Galut, when they went into exile, and they were suffering, and they were living under a foreign king, and it wasn't so it wasn't so comfortable to be Jewish and to keep the Torah. Then, when they reconnected to it, then when they reasserted their commitment to Torah in circumstances where it might have been easier not to, that's a real meaningful acceptance of the Torah. That's an acceptance of the Torah that doesn't come because of tremendous, fireworks displays by God, but it comes because the commitment is real. And that's what it means for Achashverosh. Because that was the first time they went into Galut. It was Galut Bavel. So the Sridei Eish, to sum up, the Sridei Eish says, what does the Gemara mean? It means that the acceptance of Torah at Har Sinai was flawed. It was flawed because it was the result of and accompanied by such tremendous external experiences that the human being put into a situation of such powerful external experiences essentially has no choice as to whether or not they're going to get swept up in those experiences. They have no choice in the matter. They were that powerful. And therefore the choice to say Nasav and Ishma, while you read the Psukim, it seems like a free will choice. The choice whether or not to say that was not really a choice. It was as much a choice as it would be as if God had held a mountain over their heads and said, take it or die. And that flawed experience, it was flawed because it was superficial. It was superficial because it was based on external, emotional reaction to events. He says, and that doesn't change until they're in exile and they have to recommit themselves to the Torah. Now, Rav Wolicki, Shlomo Wolbe, the author of Alei Shur, he takes a similar approach, which is not surprising. He's a bit of a Talmud of Rav Yaakov Weinberg. And in an essay that he wrote, this is not on your handout, Rav Wolicki had a beautiful line to point out the contrast between the acceptance of the Torah at Har Sinai, which is superficial and emotional, and the acceptance of the Torah after the Purim story. He says, after they accepted the Torah in Har Sinai, they made the golden calf. After they accepted the Torah, the Purim story, they went and built the Beit HaMikdash. It's a different type of acceptance. When something's the result of an emotional surge, you know what happens when that surge recedes? You can have a crisis. It's not there anymore. It's to be replaced by something else. We need another emotional surge. That's the problem. Yes?
So, what purpose do you think this Na'aseh v'Nishma acceptance would have served in the long run, rather than Hashem just putting us, lechatchila in a situation where we're accepting it of our free will?
It might have been the only thing that they were capable of at the time, in that context, and it kept us going for quite a while.
So, do you think maybe the Purim one, it was building on the original one, or that's something new and different?
I think according to this, it was building on the original one, and the language of the Gemara would support that. Kimu ma shekiblu kvar. That's like the next stage. It's like the maturing in the history of the Jewish people.
It's a very good question. First question. You said they built the Beit HaMikdash after Purim.
Yeah.
Was there much after that?
No, the second Beit HaMikdash.
Oh.
The Purim story happens in the exile between the Beit HaMikdash. It's not in the Megillah, but right after that story, it's when they built the Beit HaMikdash.
And second question, what exactly was the Sinai, Har Sinai that was so great that forced them? Just hearing God's voice and their souls going up? Was that?
We described it, the whole scene. I mean, like they have the 10 plagues in Mitzrayim, and then there's Kriyat Yam Suf, and then they get to Har Sinai, and there's the voice of God. They're hearing the voice of God. The whole experience. It says in the Torah that it was like shofars blowing, and there's this cloud of God's glory, and they're hearing God's voice, and there's flames everywhere. The whole mountain was lit on fire. It was just a powerful experience. It was the most powerful experience imaginable. So he's saying that basically that took away their free will. So to sum up, for Rav Yaakov Weinberg, this Gemara is telling us that there was a flaw in the experience at Matan Torah that was corrected, that was elevated to another level, or corrected at a later date when the Torah was reaccepted. I'd like you to flip your page over now. We're going to take a look at Rav Kook. Rav Kook approaches this Gemara from a completely different angle. Rav Kook is up here. Okay? This is not Rav Kook's entire piece on this Gemara. He has a couple pages on it. I just took out one section of it, and the rest of it I'll tell you orally. Vaytatzu b'tachtit hahar. Amar Rav Havdimi bar Chama melamed shekava HaKadosh Baruch Hu aleim et har kigigit. V'amar lahem, and he said to them, Im atem mekablim et haTorah mutav, if you accept the Torah, good. V'im lav, and if not, sham te'ekvu atchem, there you will be buried. HaChofesh haritzoni hu tochen miyuchad l'shachlel al yado et hakisharon hamusari asher la'adam. He said, free will is the specific component that allows the person to develop his ethical traits, meaning our values, our choices, our values, our ethics come from our free will. We exercise our free will. That's where free will gets us. It allows us to make choices, plain and simple. Important choices. And therefore, free will governs those things that free will governs. Like it doesn't govern, for instance, blinking your eyes, right? You know that happens instinctively, and doesn't govern the beating of your heart. Thank God you don't have to think about beating your heart, right? You wouldn't be able to live properly. It happens without free will. But all those things that are meaningful, in terms of values and ethics, and all those things that are essential to our identities. The fact that your heart beats is not part of your identity. My heart beats too, just like yours does. Right? Everything that's essential to who we are is part of our will. It's choices that we make about ourselves. However, says Rav Kook, Aval, atzmiyut haratzon ba'atzmo hu atochan ha'ma'oti shel ha'adam va'alav biyisodo lo shayach lomar shum toar shel chofesh. Ein anu b'nei chorin lirtzot o lo lirtzot. That's the last piece I'm going to translate. I'm going to say this outside. Listen to what Rav Kook says. It's so brilliant. He says, yes, we have free will about everything about ourselves, except whether or not to have free will. You do not have free will to have free will or not have free will. You have free will whether you like it or not. You have a will. You have an identity. What you do with that identity is your choice. But to be you, to have your unique will, you don't have a choice in the matter. That was forced upon you. To be you. And to have a free will. To be a human being. That you have no choice about. So you have free will about everything, except whether to have it.
Where's that at?
We're not there yet. He's not done. It's just the beginning. As he says, we're not free to want or not want. We're free to decide what we want. But to will, to have a will, that's not a choice. We have a will because God made us that way. He said all we govern is what way that will is going to go. Now, I want to deepen our understanding of this, because this is the preamble to the point he's going to make about the Gemara. We have to understand this concept well to understand what's coming next. I said before that your heartbeat is not part of your identity, which is true. And that's why I didn't give the example of heartbeat. There are parts of us that are essential to our identities. Okay? And there are parts of us that aren't. Okay? Aristotle used the term accident for something that was not essential. We use the term accident to mean something that's done by mistake. But what Aristotle, and that's really because the word accident means something that has nothing to do with it's not essential to the essence of something. So in other words, what clothing I'm wearing, or let's say a table. This is a brown table. So brown, by nature of the fact that it's an adjective, is not essential to the fact that this is a table. Table is the essential essence of what I'm talking about. Brown is something, it could be brown, it could be blue. But it would be a table whether it was brown or blue. Okay? The identity, the essence is that it's a table. Whether it's brown or blue is what's called an accident. It's something that can apply to it or not apply to it. But it doesn't change its essence. Okay? Being a human being, having free will is part of your essence. Okay? Part of your essence. If you don't have free will, you're essentially not a functioning human being. You're not a human being, really. To have a personality, to be you, that's essential. That's who you are. Okay? About those essential things, we have no free will. We have free will about pretty much everything else. What to do with the free will, that's what we have choices. But that means, and now here I'm moving into the next point he's going to make, that means that anything that's choosable, to behave this way, to not behave this way, to do this, to not do this. Okay? Anything that's choosable is not essential to the identity. Because it could be, or it could not be, but the identity would remain the same. You understand? I could behave this way, or I could behave that way. But either way, I am still me. So the choice is an external one. It's not essential to my identity. It doesn't impact my identity being my identity. I'm still me, whether I chose this or chose that. Okay, everyone with me? Is everyone still with me? Okay, it's late at night to have this discussion like this, but let's get our heads clear on this. So anything that's choosable is by definition not essential to the essence. So says Rav Kook, God had to force us to accept the Torah because he did not want the acceptance of the Torah to be understood as something that's a choice. Because if it's a choice, it's not essential to who we are. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to us, yes, you said Nasa V'Nishma, you accepted it willfully, but that's not good enough for me. I want you to accept the Torah at the level of instinct, at the level where you have no choice, so that you get the message that it isn't a choice to accept the Torah or not accept the Torah. You don't have an identity without the Torah. The same way you don't have an identity without your own free will. Just like you have no choice of whether to not to have a will and to have an identity, you have no choice about whether or not to accept the Torah. It's essential to who you are. It's not an external choice that there could be you with the Torah or you without the Torah. If you don't accept the Torah, you don't exist. That's your burial. To not accept the Torah is to commit suicide. You don't have an essence. That's what, so Rav Kook says, Rav Kook is going the opposite direction than Rav Chio Yaakov Weinberg. Rav Kook is saying the lack of choice is actually a higher level of acceptance. It gets down to the level of instinct. It's part of the essential nature of who we are. It's the essential makeup of who we are. That's the level we accepted the Torah at. It's part of the fabric of our identities. It's not just a choice we make, like what school to attend or what to do with our lives or whether to believe in, be a Democrat or a Republican. Some external choice that's not essential to our identities. No, this is at the level of our identity. So therefore, it's beyond free will. It's above free will. It's more basic than free will. Free will is external. This is more internal than that. He says, however, what happened? As time went on, and the generations go down, and the Jewish people went into exile, and they started to get far away from their inner Kedusha, from identifying fully with the Torah as part of their essential identity. When the Jew leaves Eretz Yisrael and goes into Galus, says Rav Kook, he's not living, breathing, walking, talking every day, just a Jewish identity. Judaism, it becomes like one of the things he is. It becomes an external, one of the definitions of it. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm Jewish, I went to Yale. Like, it's one of the things about me. There's me, and there's the fact that I'm Jewish. It's like a separate part of me. But that happens in Galus, says Rav Kook. So he says, when they go into Galus, they're relating to Torah as an external, as something that's a choice, yes or no, and they see an option of existing without it. An assimilation is an option of existing without the Torah, of having an identity minus the Torah. Once Jews saw it that way, in order to reconnect them, they needed to accept it intellectually as free will. Because otherwise they would have lost their connection to it. So they needed to make this lower level connection in order to sustain themselves in the exile. Okay? That's Rav Kook. If your brain isn't fried yet, here we go. This one is less abstract. Okay, this last approach is less abstract. The first two are both. There's like a machloket here in the inner psychology of the nature of man going on. Maybe two different approaches to this Gemara we've seen so far.
Is this last one your approach?
This last one is my own approach, sort of. It's based. You'll see, it's based on some good sources. It's not just like I'm not, and it's not disputing these two approaches. It's just it's approaching a different issue about this Gemara. It starts with a Tanchuma that my brain exploded the first time I read it, and I'd like to share it with you. It's a Medrash Tanchuma. For some reason, it's in Parshas Noach. Don't ask me why.
How'd you find that?
I was reading Medrash Tanchuma, and I was like, "Whoa!" that's and then like pieces started to click, and I started connected with other things. Something I worked out last year. This piece. Okay? So take a look. This is the bottom of the page here. It's a cool medrash. V'lo kiblu Yisrael et haTorah shekafal lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu dar kigigit. The Jewish people did not receive the Torah. They did not accept the Torah until God held the mountain over them like a barrel. Shneimar v'yitezu b'tachtit ha'ar, as it says that they stood in the base of the mountain. And basically here it's going to quote our Gemara, more or less. But then it's going to make an astounding comment about our Gemara. And this is also Chazal. This is a medrash. V'amar Rav Dimi bar Chama, and Rav Dimi bar Chama said, in our Gemara it's Rav Avdimi, same thing. Amar le HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, God said to the Jews, Im makablim matem et haTorah mutav, if you accept the Torah, very nice. V'im lav, and if not, sham tekvuratchem, there you'll be buried. Okay, so far the first three lines of this medrash, it has just basically quoted Rav Avdimi's line in our Gemara. Watch. V'im tomar, now the medrash Tanchuma takes a left turn here. And if you were to say, Im Tomar, if you're going to say, Al HaTorah shebichtav kafal lehem, if you were to think that God held the mountain over them and forced them to accept the written Torah, v'halo misha'asha amar lehem mekablim atem et haTorah, behold, that's not true. Because when he asked them to accept the Torah, Anu kulam amru na'aseh v'nishma, they all said na'aseh v'nishma. The Jews willfully accepted. It must be that Tosfot didn't see this Medrash Tanchuma, which is not surprising. A lot of people did not see the Medrash Tanchuma. It was not a very well publicized book. It existed in some parts of the world, in other parts not, before the printing press. It must be that Tosfot didn't see it, because it would answer their question very easily. But here's the thing. The Medrash says here, this Medrash, this idea that God forced the Jews to accept the Torah, that he held the mountain over them, is not talking about the written Torah at all. The written Torah, they willfully accepted. Because the written Torah, it's not that hard. B'tzar, it's not that painful to do. Ima'at, it's also pretty small. The written Torah is not that big. Ella, amar lahen ala Torah sheba'al peh. Rather, God said this to them. What is your problem? It's fine if the light's on. It's not off. The green light is on. It's on. It's just blacked out to not distract you. So you're distracted. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, if you accept the Torah, good. If not, I'll bury you here. I'll drop the mountain on your heads about the Torah Sheba'al Peh. He was talking about the oral Torah. When God forced them to accept the Torah, he was forcing them to accept the oral Torah. Because the oral Torah is difficult and there's so many details, etc., etc., etc. It goes on, and then the Medrash continues from here. There's like a whole other page dealing with how wonderful and how much hard work it is to learn Torah. And it goes off in this whole like spiel with psukim and like midrashim about how hard it is to learn Torah. But Medrash Tanchuma is saying the following: God lifts up the mountain over their heads. He says, "If you accept the Torah, good. If not, I'm going to bury you here." That whole scene, that idea is all referring to the oral Torah. The written Torah they willfully accepted. The oral Torah, the Masorah, the tradition, the oral tradition, that part, they had a gun to their head. That's what the Medrash Tanchuma says. Yes, Yoni?
I thought it's impossible to learn Torah without oral Torah. the written Torah without the oral Torah? Like, how would you do that?
You can't. They have to accept both.
So when you accept the written Torah, you're pretty much accepting.
They weren't. They accepted the written Torah willfully, and then God said, "You're going to need this too." And they said, "No," and He said, "No."
We'll find out.
I thought Moshe gave them the oral Torah later. I thought it wasn't at the same time when God gave them the Torah.
When it happened, it's all part of the Sinai experience. With the details of the oral Torah they got later, we're still getting the details of the oral Torah. Every time a Chiddush is made, every time a new halacha comes up, every time a new psak, there's more and more oral Torah constantly being learned. Okay? They didn't even have all the content of it. It was that they were agreeing to abide by the oral Torah. That they didn't want to agree to.
They weren't really agreeing to abide by it. This is forced upon them.
Right, exactly. Meaning, to agree to that's what they did not agree to do. They weren't agreeing to the oral Torah.
Well, obviously they would have to be agreeing to it because they agreed to it. If it was forced upon them, they would have to...
Fine. We're going around in circles. They didn't agree it was forced upon them.
Fine.
So they said fine, but that's not really called agreeing. Okay, that's... Okay, the point here is that the oral Torah is an astounding medrash. The medrash is saying that scene is talking about the oral Torah. Now, what's so astounding about it? So I'm going to share with you a couple ideas that are going to kind of click together. Okay? I'm letting you in on what I started thinking, like the train of thought that I had when I read this medrash. The days of Achashverosh. So, there's... Before... Mordechai was a member of the Anshe Knesset Havdalah, the men of the Great Assembly. The opening line of Pirkei Avot says, Moshe accepted the Torah from Har Sinai, and he gave it to Yoshua, and Yoshua gave it to the Zakanim, the elders, and the elders gave it to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Oh no, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Nevi'im gave it to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. What's the next line? Hey Mamru, they said the following things and blah 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 blah, all of Pirkei Avos. Okay, the opening of Pirkei Avos says Moshe received the Torah on Sinai and he gave it to Yoshua. Yoshua gave it to the Zakanim. The Zakanim gave it to the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im gave it to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. And what they do? They started teaching it. That Mishnah is not talking about the written Torah. You should know this. This is the pshat of the Mishnah. That Mishnah is referring to the oral tradition. The written Torah was given to all of Klal Yisrael. Every Jew accepted it. The oral Torah, the Jewish people were told, by the way, you also have to do everything the rabbis tell you. There's a whole Masorah, there's a whole rabbinic legal system. You have to follow everything they say. But for the entire period of time, from Matan Torah until the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah made a critical decision to start teaching it publicly, it was not public property. The masses were not exposed to it at all. It was taught by the elite to the elite. Jews in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash and before it had to follow what the rabbis said, but they didn't know why. They didn't know anything about it. Moshe gave it to Yoshua. Yoshua gave it to just the Zakanim. The Zakanim gave it to just the Nevi'im. And the Nevi'im gave it to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah said, we're going to start teaching this to everybody. Beginning of the Mishnaic period. Beginning of discussions, of Gemara, of back and forth, of Svaras, of writing things down, of spreading it out there, of schools. Suddenly, the oral Torah, not suddenly, it happens during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, starting with the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the period we know as the time of the Tanaim. That period is the opening up of Torah Sheba'al Peh to become public property. It starts with the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, that's the time of Achashverosh. So why did they do that? Why was the Torah Sheba'al Peh the private property, privately passed down from Moshe to Yoshua to those Talmidim to the Talmidei Chacham? Only the Gedolim had it. And then they opened it up. Well, they went into Galus and Bavel, and in a span of 70 years, a flash, 70 years. We've been in Galus for 2,000. 70 years. The play, everyone's assimilating. The Megillah opens. It's not even 70 years. It's like 55 years in or something. 60. Everyone's eating at Achashverosh's Suda. The Jewish people are assimilating rapidly. They leave Israel and boom! It takes like a generation and a half and Klal Yisrael's assimilating. That's fast. Why'd that happen? Because people, when they're living in the land of Israel, so they're living in a Jewish context, in a Jewish culture, and it's run by the Jewish leadership, and the rules are Jewish, so there's no reason for them to stray. They go into Galus, and everything starts unraveling because they're not in a Jewish context anymore. Their leadership isn't necessarily Jewish. Their laws aren't necessarily Jewish, and the average Jew did not have a kesher to most of the Torah. Most of the Torah is the Torah Shebaal Peh. The average Jew didn't have a kesher to it. And the Chachamim said, you know what? If we're going to survive a Galus, we need to have a Torah Shebaal Peh that is the property of all of Klal Yisrael. We need everyone to accept the Torah Shebaal Peh. And we need them to understand it and to know it and to live it and to learn it. So they made a decision, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, B'yamei Achashverosh. They made a decision that it's time to start teaching Torah Shebaal Peh publicly. So, now, let's go back to the Gemara for a second. The words for the acceptance of the Torah in the time of Achashverosh, there's two words the Gemara uses. Kiyamu v'kiblu. Yarom, just listen to this 5 minutes. This itself is a great vart for Purim. Kiyamu v'kiblu. Now, let's think about the words kiyamu v'kiblu. I want everyone to think for a second. Kiyamu, kiblu. What does kiyamu mean? They fulfilled. Kiyamu. L'kayem. Do you ever hear the expression to be makayim a mitzvah? To fulfill a mitzvah, right? I have a question for you. What's the difference between doing and fulfilling a mitzvah? I did the mitzvah, I fulfilled the mitzvah. What's the difference between those two?
Fulfilling is you really want to do it. It's deep. It's passionate.
You can
but I did the mitzvah of eating a kazayas of matzah.
Doing it is passionate.
I fulfilled the mitzvah of eating a kazayas of matzah. No, they're both actions.
No,
I did or I fulfilled. What's the difference between l'kayem and la'asot from Iran? What's the difference between those two words? What's the difference between the two words as words? L'kayem mitzvah, la'asot mitzvah.
What's with meaning?
You've accomplished the goal. When you're makayim, it implies.
So the word l'kayem means to establish. The word in a certain. Basically, I'll tell you what. I'll take the rabbit out of the hat now. L'kayem and la'asot are actually synonyms, except that there's a connotation. That l'kayim implies a deeper strength and permanence to the doing of the mitzvah, whereas doing it is a very external type of thing. Now, ready? Second word, kiblu. What's the difference between lishmoa, to hear, and lekabel, to accept? What's the difference? They're really the same thing, except, meaning physiologically they're the same thing. I accept something or I hear it. Hearing is sort of an external type of act. There's nothing. Accepting implies that I have some relationship to it, that implying some permanence, some deeper. It's a deeper form of hearing. L'kayem is a deeper form of la'asot. L'kabel is a deeper form of lishmoa. Kiyamu v'kiblu is naseh v'nishma at a deeper level. Naseh, kiyamu. Nishma, kiblu. You understand? Naseh v'nishma, will do and will hear, gets deeper when it becomes kiyamu and kiblu. It's a deeper level. It's the same thing, but supercharged. Now what happens? According to the Medrash Tanchuma, kiyamu v'kiblu is talking about the oral law. Naseh v'nishma is talking about the written law. Now what does that mean? When they accept the Torah at Har Sinai, they have no relationship to the oral law. They're just told they have to do what the rabbis say. They have a relationship to the written law. Naseh v'nishma. Very nice. Naseh v'nishma is a very nice relationship. We're willing to do it. We're going to learn it. But how close can you get to really understanding Torah Shebichsav? It's the Word of God. You're obedient. You do it. You learn it to whatever extent you can learn it. And to a certain extent, you can't really get that far because it's whatever God said. And the real reason He said it, I'll never know. Oral law, I have no relationship to. It's like a gun to my head. I have to do what the rabbis say. Do I have any understanding why? No. Is my will involved in it? No. Is my knowledge involved in it? No. It's like having a gun to my head. The whole time, from Matan Torah until the Anshe Knesset Gedolah open things up, the relationship of the average Jew to the oral law is basically you have to do it because you have to do it. He doesn't understand anything. He understands Torah Shebachsav better, at least that he can read and translate and learn. Along comes the Anshe Knesset Gedola, and they open up Torah Sheba'al Peh to the public. And they start teaching it to people. And when you learn Torah Sheba'al Peh, you really understand it. There's kashas and terutzim and svaras, and you get into it. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh. We learn Gemara. It's a much deeper understanding. So not only did they get exposure to Torah Sheba'al Peh, but the relationship they had to it was much deeper than the relationship that they had to Torah Shebachsav. Because they could get their heads into it, they could get their heads around it. Kiyamu v'kiblu. It deepened their relationship to Torah. They were now exposed to Torah Sheba'al Peh. So this is what happened in the days of Achashverosh. In the days of Achashverosh, when they saw that the assimilation had become so powerful, the Anshe Knesset Gedola made a choice. And they said, if we're going to survive a long gullus, and there's a long gullus coming, this 70 years was nothing. And if we're going to survive a long gullus, we're going to need the people to have a deep and strong connection, a kimu v'kiblu connection to Torah Sheba'al Peh. And they start teaching the Torah to everybody. And at that period of time, as a result, why does the Gemara say, kimu v'kiblu b'mei Achashverosh? How come Rava doesn't say b'mei Mordechai v'Esther? That would have been much nicer. Or b'mei Ezra, same time period. Why b'mei Achashverosh? Because he's emphasizing that the whole motivation for it was the fact that the Jews were assimilating in the gullus of Achashverosh, symbolized by eating at that feast, that the Jews were all assimilating. And they went, whoa, we have to expose Klal Yisrael to the Torah Sheba'al Peh. We have to start teaching it to everybody. We have to start spreading it. And it can no longer be something that they're just doing because they're forced to, because they're not going to do it in gullus. So they expose everyone to it, and then Kimu Masha Kiblu Kvar, Klal Yisrael has a deeper relationship with Torah Sheba'al Peh. So that's the shir for tonight. Wow. Thank you for listening.
So, why was it a b'diavad then? It seems like it would be a great lechatchila. Like, from the start.
So it was b'diavad.
I thought you did, because you were saying like once they saw that the Jews wouldn't be able to handle their galus, then they there's b'diavad.
They realized that they made a mistake. No, they realized it was a mistake not to expose everyone to it. Okay. Yeah. Kimu v'kiblu is my own.
Wow.
Kimu v'kiblu is my own word. No, I thought of that years ago. Kimu v'kiblu is my own word. It's heavy, huh?
I'm going to use it too. Wow.
Yaram, you like the word?
That was awesome, Rabbi.
It's going to take 25 minutes to process.
Yeah, I know.
I know this.
So I use a specific kimu v'kiblu.
What?
That's why Dafki uses kimu
Kimu v'kiblu. It's deeper. It's Nasa v'nishma, but deeper. You like that much?
This actually answers my question I asked you. Like, I really wanted to answer. Like, why do we learn Gemara? Why do we do this? This is actually the answer. I was kind of like,
Good answer.
like 10:30 tomorrow is your bathroom.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Go out with your
Where?
Tomorrow morning we're gonna check the Eruv in the mud. It's gonna be very muddy tomorrow.
It's gonna be horrible.
There's a few parts that are very muddy.
wellies.
On a normal day, it's gonna be a swamp.
Big wellies.
I have my army boots somewhere.
Cool.
They let you keep your army?
Yeah.
You got your whole kit?
You like it? Thank you.
Maybe here's your child different, right?
Oh, hello.
I know this might be a question for a different time, but if you do a sikha or when you have a charusa, could you understand what it means that all of us list how many people this is list how many people came out of Egypt and how many people